From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I'd always expected the jury to take some time to come to their decisions in the trial of Lucy Letby. It was quite a suspenseful moment when the jury handed down their first verdicts. Up to that point, the jury had been out for quite a few weeks, which was expected given the length of the trial, one of the longest in the history of this country, and the number of charges they were considering. And as the first verdicts were read out, there was a gasp from the area where Letby's parents, who had attended the whole trial, were sitting. Lucy Letby looked at her mother and then burst into tears. And at that point, as she was stood up and led out of the dock, the families of the children involved in the trial all started to hug and console one another. For the next 2 weeks, the jury came back with more and more verdicts. This was something that we couldn't report at the time due to reporting restrictions. On Friday, the 18th of August, 2023, the jury came back at lunchtime. They hadn't reached a verdict on 6 counts of attempted murder. The judge could have allowed them to continue deliberating, but at that point, the jury had been out for weeks. Mr. Justice Goss ultimately discharged them, lifted the restrictions, and the verdicts were made public.
We can now report that Lucy Letby has been found guilty of the murder of 7 babies, the attempted murder of 6 babies.
The 33-year-old attacked the infants at the Countess of Chester Hospital over the course of a year between June 2015 and June 2016.
Amongst her victims were baby boys, baby girls, sets of twins, and included 2 boys from a set of triplets.
She was described by the prosecution as calculated and cold-blooded.
At that point, the public knew that Lucy Letby had become Britain's most prolific child serial killer.
It's been a year since Lucy Letby was convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 more. In July, at a new trial, she was convicted of attempting to murder a 7th. 2 trials, years of police investigations, and several unanimous convictions by a jury of her peers. So why are doubts about her guilt starting to grow?
Recent reporting has raised questions about the evidence heard at her trial. And now, the Conservative MP David Davis has put his head above the parapet on the issue.
Yesterday, the New Yorker magazine published a 13,000-word inquiry into the Lucy Letby trial, which raised enormous concerns about both the logic and competence of the statistical evidence that was a central part of that trial.
It appears extraordinarily incriminating because she is the only nurse that seems to be associated with all of the, quote, suspicious events. And people ask, well, what are the odds of that happening by chance? It couldn't be coincidence, and therefore it must be something else, and that something else is murder. Several problems come up with this kind of evidence, though. When closely examined, it often falls apart.
The story today: why some experts are questioning Lucy Letby's conviction.
My name is Ali Mitib, and I'm a news reporter at The Times.
Ali, when the judge lifted reporting restrictions, when those verdicts came in, Lucy Letby was front-page news, not only in Britain. The case was reported on all over. Just describe the sort of reaction.
Like you say, the conviction took the world by storm. It was covered internationally by newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, El País, Der Spiegel, you name it, they covered it. Letby's mugshot was featured on every front page of every British newspaper. One columnist wrote that she has thrown open the door to hell and the stench of evil overwhelms us all. Several aspects of the case gave it such cut through. Firstly, I think it was the sheer scale of Letby's offending and how long she offended for. The trial at Manchester Crown Court heard about her year-long campaign to kill and harm babies, most of whom were premature. She joined the roll call of the country's worst murderers, and she was one of only a handful of women to ever receive a whole life tariff.
So she'd been locked up until she died?
Locked up until you die. No chance of getting out. Secondly, I think it was Letby's betrayal of her duty of care to her patients. In this case, premature babies at the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester, and their families in the most heinous of ways. They believed that she would do everything in her power to make sure that their children were safe, all the while she sought to do them harm. Thirdly, I believe it was a lack of a definitive motive which gave this trial such cut-through with the public. One of the most puzzling things for us as journalists who were covering the trial is, why would she do it? Why would she take such actions against the most vulnerable babies you can imagine? And we're talking about babies which are small enough to fit in the palms of their parents' hands. And despite months of court proceedings and years-long investigations by the police, no one has managed to pin down her motivations.
And Ali, there are, as you say, so many reasons why this case really gripped the imagination of the public when those verdicts first came in a year ago now. Just take us back, though, and just remind us of the details of the case and what Lucy Letby was actually on trial for.
Lucy Letby is a 34-year-old woman originally from Hereford. She worked as a neonatal nurse at the Countess of Chester Hospital from 2012 to 2016, when she was taken off the neonatal unit and placed on clerical duties. Letby was arrested shortly after dawn on July 3rd, 2018, and it was one of 3 arrests before she was ultimately charged. After raiding Letby's home in Chester, police found notes handwritten by Letby saying, "I am evil, I did this," along with medical documents relating to some of the victims, which should not have been brought home. The police considered these items as trophies from her killing, and she was also found to have searched Facebook for the parents of the victims, sometimes months after the deaths. Her defense claimed that she was the victim of a conspiracy by 4 consultants to have her removed to cover for their failings, but there was no evidence of that. They also claimed that the unit was understaffed, unsafe, and that the deaths were somehow connected with the unit having a sewage problem. The trial was the subject of massive public interest, and that, of course, extended to social media. This can somewhat be expected nowadays, but what was odd was that true crime enthusiasts had become a regular presence at the trial.
Oh, really?
Yes, so what happened was they started to watch proceedings from an annex where the public gallery was situated. All those who attended the trial were made to sign a document saying they understood that there was an order restricting the reporting of names of victims and their parents, as well as some witnesses. However, the restrictions were broken in threads on Reddit, and this is something that could have possibly derailed the trial. On social media, there were a number of armchair detectives proclaiming Letby's innocence and claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and therefore not strong enough to convict her. Days after the verdict, a campaign for a retrial emerged, with a website set up to claim that the nurse's conviction may represent the greatest miscarriage of justice the UK has ever witnessed. This wasn't just limited to people on social media. For some of those who knew Lucy Letby, it was a hard pill to swallow that their friend was guilty of these crimes. Prior to conviction, I had spent weeks driving across the length and breadth of this country to speak to her family, her friends, and her colleagues in an effort to build up a picture of who Lucy Letby was and what she was like. To her friends, she was incredibly supportive and caring. One school friend who hadn't seen Letby for some years described her to me as a Mary Poppins-like figure. among her friendship group. She often carried kind of a rucksack full of remedies for any eventuality, like plasters, antiseptic wipes, spare tampons. She was known as someone who was supportive of her friends, who would always be there for her friends.
Early nursing.
Early nursing, yes. After her conviction, someone who attended secondary school with her said that her friends still supported her. And that, quote, "Unless Lucy turned around and said, 'I'm guilty,' I will never believe she's guilty."
When does this become a more serious movement?
There has been a big shift in recent months, and that is primarily because of a piece by the New Yorker magazine questioning the safety of a conviction.
This was a very long piece, and you couldn't read it in this country for quite a long time. Just talk us through the arguments that they made.
The article suggests that there were no crimes at all, and that Letby was a victim of a gross miscarriage of justice. It cast doubt on a number of elements in the trial. One of the elements was Dr. Dewey Evans, the chief prosecution witness. Dr. Evans was a retired paediatrician from Wales who had been the clinical director of the neonatal and children's department at his hospital. And after seeing that there was a criminal investigation into the Countess of Chester, he wrote into the NCA, the National Crime Agency, Britain's equivalent of the FBI, to offer his services. Several months into the trial, the defence asked Mr. Justice Goss, the presiding judge, to strike evidence given by Evans and to stop him from returning to the witness box, but the request was denied. The defence had learned that a month before, in a separate case, a judge on the Court of Appeal had described a medical report written by Evans in an unrelated civil case as worthless, saying that it made no effort to provide a balanced opinion. We should say that the New Yorker acknowledged that Dr. Evans disagreed with that judgment. It's hard to underestimate the importance of Dr. Dewey Evans in this case. The evidence against Lucy Letby was largely circumstantial and relied on the analysis of medical notes by two experts, one of which was Dr. Evans. The prosecution also called dozens of Letby's colleagues who said she behaved suspiciously, but there was no definitive smoking gun in the sense of Lucy Letby being caught on CCTV harming a child. That didn't exist, which is why there was a lot of different opinions on whether she would be convicted. The New Yorker piece suggests that Dr. Dewey Evans was one of the key people behind the hypothesis that some of the children died through an air embolism. So an air embolism occurs when air or gas is admitted into the vascular system. Lucy Letby used a range of methods to murder or attempt to murder these infants. One of them was the injection of air into the nasal gastric tube, which goes into the baby's stomach, an air embolism. Other ways include overfeeding the premature babies or poisoning them with insulin. Now, the New Yorker piece cast doubt as to whether air embolisms could explain what happened to the infants who collapsed. Dr. Evans drew on the descriptions of the babies exhibiting an unusual skin discoloration shortly before they collapsed and concluded that they suffered from air embolisms. He cited a paper written in 1989 by Dr. Shu Lee, which detailed 53 cases in newborn babies, some of whom had also shown signs of skin discoloration. However, Lee later said that none of the descriptions of the baby's discolorations given by witnesses in the trial matched the sort that he had recorded. The article also raised concerns about insulin testing. With regards to insulin testing, it is important to remember the strength of the case against Lucy Letby. The cases of baby F and baby L who were injected with insulin were pivotal. They were the only victims for whom there was unimpeachable evidence of sabotage. Lucy Letby's defense didn't contest that the infants were poisoned with insulin, but they did deny that Letby had done it.
And how does the New Yorker cast doubt on that?
The New Yorker suggests that the tests used were not up to scratch. It claimed that the guidelines for the Royal Liverpool lab, where the tests were conducted, warned that its insulin test was, quote, not suitable for the investigation, unquote, of whether synthetic insulin had been administered. Alan Wayne Jones, a forensic toxicologist in Sweden, who has also written about the use of insulin as a means of murder, told the New Yorker that the test used by the Royal Liverpool lab was not sufficient for use as evidence in a criminal prosecution. He recommended that a more stringent test be used, but the Countess of Chester never ordered one as the children recovered. The New York article framed the prosecution's case as hinging on one crucial graph shown to the jury at the start of the trial. On one axis were 25 suspicious baby deaths, or collapses, between June 2015 and June 2016. On the other axis were the 38 nurses who had been on shift at the ward. The only nurse present for every shift was Lucy Letby. However, a month before the trial commenced, there was a report by the Royal Statistical Society that cast doubt on this kind of evidence.
Would you mind just starting by introducing yourself to our listeners?
I'm William Thompson. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of California, Irvine. I'm a lawyer and a psychologist and had quite a long career in which I did a lot of writing about the use and misuse of statistics and other kinds of scientific evidence in law. I was invited a few years ago by the Royal Statistical Society, a very distinguished group, to take part in their statistics and law section, which in turn led me to get involved in drafting of this official report of the society that looked at allegations of serial misconduct by medical professionals.
So this is the report titled Healthcare Serial Killer or Coincidence. Just tell us a bit about that. I mean, what were the conclusions that you came to?
Well, the Royal Statistical Society was asked to examine this problem because people were aware of a large number of these cases that have come up all over the world where a previously trusted healthcare person, a doctor or a nurse, was accused of serial misconduct, often serial murder. Statistical evidence is often very important in these cases. And there's been a history of the misuse or misunderstanding of statistical evidence in such cases. And so the purpose of the report was to discuss these questions and provide some guidance to the legal system and to police and other investigators on how to properly investigate these cases. This is an effort by statisticians and people who study uses and misuse of statistics to give guidance to the justice system on how to do a better job at this really difficult task of distinguishing somebody who might be a serial killer from cases where somebody might be falsely incriminated due to a series of coincidences or misapplication or misunderstanding of statistical evidence.
That report was published, and within a month, the trial of Lucy Letby began. Did you follow that case at all?
I did not follow it closely until recently. I know there's been a lot of recent commentary I've seen on the case. Some of the other members of the committee that drafted the report were more aware of the case than I was and were had some concerns about the case. I do know that the Royal Statistical Society, after the report had been reviewed and was officially released, took steps to make the litigants in that case aware of it. So the Crown prosecutors and the defense and the court were sent copies of it. From what I can see, it doesn't appear to have had much influence on their actions, however.
Talk us through that, because statistics did end up being a key part of the case against Lucy Letby.
Well, our report talked about the way these cases often go, and I think I should start by saying that the Lucy Letby case, as I understand it, seems to have a lot in common with a number of other similar cases that have been tried. And a key aspect of this case is that a particular individual is incriminated in part because that individual seems to be associated with an extraordinary number of bad outcomes, unexpected deaths, for example. I understand a key part of that case was a spreadsheet showing which nurses had worked and showing that Lucy Letby was associated with a long unbroken stream of, quote, unexpected deaths. Now, that's a kind of evidence we've seen in many other cases, and part of what we explain in our report is why evidence of that type can be problematic and why it is often difficult to evaluate correctly. I'm not saying such evidence is worthless, but I'm saying it has to be evaluated very carefully.
A lot of people seeing that chart where they see, the number of deaths or serious incidents involving babies on one side, and they see Lucy Letby's shifts on the other,
Right.
that would lead them to one conclusion. As somebody who deals with statistics, talk us through what you make of that reasoning.
Yeah, I know it appears extraordinarily incriminating because she is the only nurse that seems to be associated with all of the, quote, suspicious events. And people ask, well, what are the odds of that happening by chance? It couldn't be coincidence, and therefore it must be something else, and that something else is murder. Several problems come up with this kind of evidence, though. When closely examined, it often falls apart. One problem is that people don't realize how possible it is for seemingly extraordinary series of events, clusters of events to occur by coincidence. It might be extremely unlikely that one nurse that you would pick in advance, if you picked Lucy Letby in advance and said, how often is it that she would have this many deaths on her ward of babies she was responsible for, prospectively, the probability might be extraordinarily low. But if you ask the question, what's the probability some nurse somewhere in some hospital in the world will have an unlucky series of events like this just by chance, the probability is really not that low. It's like asking, what's the probability that you will win the lottery? Very unlikely. But what's the probability someone will win the lottery? Very likely, right? And so that's number one. Seemingly extraordinary clusters of events can and do happen by chance. Number two is that there often is subjectivity and bias in the way these lists are constructed. Not because of any bad intentions by investigators who are looking into these cases, by no means, but when they try to assemble such lists, people often are inadvertently biased in ways that makes the evidence look more incriminating than it is. So, for example, the question someone has to look at a series of deaths of children in this ward where children, do die, and ask, well, which of them will we consider suspicious and which ones are not suspicious?
Yeah.
Now, the problem is that determination occurs in the context of a criminal investigation against a particular individual. When you make those determinations, it's absolutely vital that the people who make the classification suspicious or not don't know whether the cases involve the person who's under suspicion. Because if they do, there's a psychological tendency, this is well established, this is well known. Scientists have appreciated this for a very long time. There's a tendency to interpret the data in a confirmatory manner. So if, for example, there was some hint that a particular baby who died may have been one who was associated with Letby, and the investigator knew Letby was under suspicion, that could, without any bad intent, but that could unconsciously bias the interpretation in a particular way. What the Royal Statistical Society report showed is you don't need very many of these. The bias can be quite subtle. If the bias influences the classification of only a few cases, it can turn what would otherwise look like random events into seemingly damning events.
So, Ali, what happens now? Is there a chance that there can be another appeal?
Lucy Letby has exhausted the appeals process. She has twice sought leave to appeal her initial convictions from last year on several grounds, and twice she has been denied. Most recently, her legal team have argued that her convictions were unsafe because Mr. Justice Goss was mistaken in law when he refused 4 different applications from the defence. They include arguments that the evidence from the prosecution's key witness, Dr. Dewey Evans, should have been struck out for being dogmatic and biased, that the medical evidence behind her fatally injecting air into the baby's bloodstreams was very weak and could not be relied upon, that the judge was wrong to direct the jury that they did not have to be sure of the precise act or acts that led to the baby's collapse or death, and lastly, the judge failed to properly investigate a complaint about a juror in the final days of the trial, when they were allegedly overheard saying that they had made up their minds from the start about Letby's guilt. It was later suggested that the complaint may have been made maliciously, as the complaint was traced back to a cafe owner who had been in a dispute with a juror's partner over the sale of an iPhone.
Oh, it was very complicated.
Very complicated. In a 59-page ruling, the appeal court judges said that Mr. Justice Goss's handling of the trial had been thoughtful, fair, comprehensive and correct. They ruled that none of the 4 legal challenges advanced by Letby were arguable. Lucy Letby has always denied harming a baby in her care. After being given a whole life order at the retrial sentencing earlier this year, she turned to the court before being taken down to the cells and cried, "I'm innocent."
So does that mean, if she's exhausted the appeal process, that this case just can't be looked at again?
Legally speaking, the appeals process has been exhausted. And for Letby, there is one hope of returning to the Court of Appeal, and that is the Criminal Cases Review Commission. The Criminal Cases Review Commission, or CCRC, is the statutory body responsible for investigating alleged miscarriages of justice in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. It is the only such body which has the power to send the case to the appeal court if it concludes that there is a realistic possibility that the court will overturn or reduce a sentence.
What does that come down to? I mean, how do they make that decision?
In order to refer the case to the court, the commission usually has to identify new evidence or a new legal argument that means that the jury have been sufficiently misled enough to bring the conviction into question. The evidence must not have been considered at the time of the trial or at the initial appeal. So if some new evidence emerges and the CCRC deems it significant enough to take action, Lucy Letby could be back in the courts.
I mean, there are experts who are now raising doubts about her conviction. Would they be able to give evidence? Would they be the basis for an appeal now?
Under the rules of the CCRC, the evidence must not have been considered at the time of the trial or at the initial appeal. So this means that if the defence spoke to a particular expert but did not call them to give evidence, that is not grounds for an appeal. As it stands, it is unlikely that CCRC will act, but if significant evidence were to emerge, if it is significant enough, the CCRC are bound to look at the case again and send it back to the courts.
And we hear now that David Davis, a former Conservative cabinet minister, was involved with trying to mount an appeal with Mike Lynch, the man who died in this yacht accident. But they were actually looking at this case.
Yes, Mike Lynch and David Davis had intended to look at the case. And David Davis is actually someone who, his attention was grabbed by the New Yorker. He was someone who spoke in Parliament about the New Yorker piece. He used parliamentary privilege to ask why British readers were barred from viewing the article.
That article was blocked from publication on the UK internet, I understand, because of a court order. Now, I'm sure that court order was well intended, but it seems to me in defiance of open justice. Would the Lord Chancellor look into this matter and report back to the House?
If she's, in the future, found not to be guilty, it does make us question two of the biggest institutions that society relies on, the NHS and the justice system. It sort of raises serious questions about both.
I think it's very hard for a majority of the public to believe that the justice system and the NHS could have got it so wrong in the event that Lucy Letby is cleared and that her convictions were deemed to be a miscarriage of justice. It's important to remember that successful appeals against the conviction are extremely rare in the UK, but they do happen. So there is precedent of a murder conviction being overturned after statistics were heavily relied on at trial. We saw this in the case of Sally Clark. Sally Clark was an English solicitor who in November 1999 became the victim of a miscarriage of justice when she was found guilty of the murder of her 2 infant sons. The prosecution was found to have relied on flawed statistical evidence presented by a paediatrician who testified that the chance of 2 children from an affluent family suffering SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, was 1 in 73 million. This was criticised by the Royal Statistical Society, who said that there was no statistical basis for the physician's claim and expressed concerns at the misuse of statistics in court. But I think it's important to remember that Lucy Letby has been convicted of 7 murders and 7 counts of attempted murder. And the jury's verdict has to be respected. Unless there are significant revelations, she will remain guilty of those crimes and will continue to be Britain's most prolific child serial killer.
That was the news reporter for The Times, Ali Mitib, and earlier you heard from the Professor Emeritus of Criminology, Law and Society at UC Irvine, William Thompson. You can find all of The Times reporting on the Letby case at thetimes.com. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Fiona Leach. Sound design was by Tom Birchall, and the theme tune was by Mal Assetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything you've heard on this episode or any others, do drop us a line to thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.